Hello, everyone. One of the things that contributes to the bewilderment that people feel about the anxiety state and can be a barrier towards recovery if it's not overcome is this idea that people are shocked that they have anxiety because they had a happy childhood, a good upbringing, and happy life, many good moments, in their childhood, teenage years, adult life, and so they don't really understand why they're in the anxiety state. There is a narrative that says, we have to delve into the past, we have to find all the trauma from our past in order to heal, or if you have a mental health challenge or a stress challenge, whatever the narrative is, we've got to figure out what went on in the past to figure out why we are where we are now. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Can you have anxiety, or can you end up in the anxiety state? Can you end up sensitized? Can your nervous system become sensitized even if you otherwise have had a good, happy life? The answer is yes. So when we reflect back, or when I'm working with a client and we start to talk about life, talk about sensitization, often people start to see different aspects of life that were more stressful than they thought. So you can have great parents, a loving family, but still have experienced stressful events in your life that started to add sensitization or started to put pressure and tension on the nervous system. So stuff might have happened at school, which was outside your family circle. Maybe stuff did happen in your family, but assuming you feel you otherwise had a happier life, there could have been stuff that happened at school. It might have been stuff that happened when you were a teenager, difficult experiences. There can just be lots of what you might call smaller stressors, everyday stresses. There might be bigger traumas, witnessing a car accident, not being able to process that emotion, that stress. It could be something that happened to you, some physical harm that came upon you at some point. Now, I say this with a kind heart. It doesn't really matter what the trauma is or the stress that you experienced was. Obviously, it matters to you at the time in terms of the suffering, so we want to absolutely acknowledge that. But in terms of the anxiety state and sensitization, any stress that's not processed through the system that accumulates over time will lead to sensitization if there's more stress coming in and it's not being understood or processed. And because what happens is we start to go into defensive mode. The pressure rises, the tension rises, and we think life's dangerous, all unconsciously, by the way. We start to go into hypervigilance. The flight or fight learns that, hang on, this stuff happened and you better avoid that in the future, or we better avoid that, so we better go into hypervigilance mode, scan, think, overthink things, analyze in order to stay safe. It's a learned habit. Obviously, when we're young, that we're more predisposed to go into that state earlier on, and that can continue through life because the habit's already formed. But we're pretty good at coping with stress. We can still function, we can have great roles, we can be very successful at school, at work, we can push through, and we might desensitize a little bit throughout life so it doesn't manifest into the anxiety state until later. For some of us it happens early. Again, it doesn't really matter, we can cope until we can't. So if the stress of life, or this living a life in survival mode of hypervigilance, starts to then go over the threshold, as I've talked about, and you become highly sensitized with these exaggerated physical, emotional symptoms that can, obviously the rumination, obsessive thinking, all of the above. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to have had a traumatic childhood for that to happen. It can just be a series of events. So what I always encourage people to do is just sort of at the high level, not start digging necessarily, but just to go, how was life for me? Was it just this one event that was the trigger, this work event, which has led to my first panic attack? Or was it actually perhaps other things going on a lot earlier in life, or over the last 5 years, 10 years? Again, it doesn't really matter, that have led to this state, because it's not random. Anxiety is not random. One stressful work event, one difficult breakup is not going to leave you in the anxiety state. Yes, they will be stressful, but these individual events on their own, it's very rare they're going to lead you into the anxiety state. Even if you witness something very traumatic, if you were in the armed forces and you're in a war zone, one event can be difficult at the time, but a lot of people don't go on to experience anxiety. A lot of people do because that's that repeated exposure in war zones. They can't get away from it. They've got to go into it over and over again, and that's understandably going to really sensitize the nervous system. But it's not really one thing. Often we get hooked on this one thing happened and now I've got anxiety. It does not work like that. The body is designed to cope with stress, to cope with short-term stress. I had a lot of stressful things happen to me early on in life, and I didn't end up in the anxiety state straight away. It's this cumulative effect of the stress and me not dealing with it and processing it over the years that led me to sort of land in the anxiety state, go over that threshold where I started to get these what felt like constant symptoms, severe symptoms, when I was about 30. So I haven't had a client who I've spoken to once we start talking who, after we start talking, doesn't relatively quickly start to realize, oh yeah, actually maybe I can, even though I'm, great family, great childhood. Obviously some of us don't have that, so it's more obvious. But even if we've had otherwise a good life, great career, we've got a great family, the two things can coexist. It just means that opportunity now is start to learn the tools and the reasons and the lifestyle habits that maybe are keeping the sensitization going, and learn the tools to start to practice with it, to allow, slow down and release this tension over time, practice with the difficult symptoms so that we can allow our body to reset, recharge and recover, which obviously leads to desensitization and recovery. So again, in short, absolutely, you can have an otherwise great life. We don't have to have a full-on traumatic story to tell, and that's okay. It's hard for those who have had those. They're hard. Whether you have one or not, recovery is possible, but it can be a series of small, more everyday stresses that build. It can be big, obvious stresses or trauma that you've experienced that leads to sensitization. But the rule of thumb is, if you are sensitized, it's not random. There is a logical reason, and the important bit is to be able to land on that yourself and accept it and go, I get why I'm in this state now. Because if we can accept it, we can then start to recover. If we're sort of not really understanding it, we might think, oh, well, it's just me. It's just the way I am. It's just my brain. That's the reason why I'm anxious. And of course, that fixed view is very unhelpful because it takes the power away from you. It takes away your ability to recover, when there is always a logical and predictable explanation as to how everyone I've spoken to over the years ends up in this state. I hope that helps. If you've got any questions, let me know. If you are struggling to come to this realization, do book in a coaching session. A lot of people find it useful to talk it through to get a bit more clarity around all of this. I hope to see you again very soon. Take care.